Hi, I'm Nightly Assets, and today I'm going to show you the Modular City Street Asset Pack. So here we have the example scene, which is built up out of a ton of different objects. Even the little lines here are individually editable, if that suits your need. Let's just start the game here. I imported the standard Unity car, so we can kind of move around. Frame rate's terrible right now. That's just because I'm also recording. And as you can see, everything has its own colliders. Most of it is box colliders. Some of it have custom colliders. For instance, the crosswalk right here, that needs a custom collider. And the assets are set up in a way that you can manipulate everything you want to fit your needs. So if you have a different kind of road system, this is heavily based on an American kind of road system. But if you have a different kind of road system, you can definitely use these assets to make your own. And these are just some ideas. The way these sidewalks are set up and the way the streets are set up is just an idea of how you could possibly use the assets, but you can definitely take the assets and make kind of your own thing with them. So let's get out of the game and take a closer look at each individual parts. And I've separated them in 3 other example scenes. And let's start with the sidewalks, actually. So these are all the parts that were used to make the entire scene you saw just earlier. And it's pretty much all you need for most scenarios. Everything is nicely set up with the UVs to have these kind of lines right there, as you would want them to be for a high quality kind of asset. And these are the gutters that you can place right here. And this one's barely visible, which is a very subtle kind of dirt that you can apply in the same manner. Now you can see these curbs have maybe some slight variation. For instance, the red and the yellow. And that's actually a pretty nice thing about it. I've attached a script called curb color. And the way this is set up, and the way all these materials are set up, are that they are GPU instance materials. So we can attach a script that edits the instanced properties and still render the whole thing in one go, more or less. So if we just take a quick look at the frame debugger. Now obviously this particular scene is actually gonna run worse than the scene before this, and that's just because now the camera's looking at every single individual piece that it has, and they're all unique, so it's not going to be able to batch any of this. But say I do something like this, and now I can edit the curb color, and we have 3 variations on the surface. We have yellow, red, and gray. But gray is actually a randomizer between 5. So we have these 5 colors of red, yellow, and then we have 3 types of gray, and gray will just kind of randomly assign one of these colors. So this one's clearly different. I'll talk about the tiles in a minute. So yeah, that's pretty nice. So no 2 instances will look exactly the same, but they are going to be batched together, which is pretty good for performance. And let me just show you that. Let's see. This one, yeah. So we can render all these curves in one go. Okay. As for the tiles that you were seeing, that uses a similar kind of script as the curbs, in the sense that it also changes the a material property. And another material property that it has is the tiling. Now, this one I've set up pretty much specifically for how these sidewalk tiles are set up. So right now what it does is, this is just a step size that's just based on how large one of these tiles is. And it's gonna randomize the UVs, or not randomize, it's gonna offset the UVs. So no two pieces are gonna be exactly the same, but they are still gonna connect nicely together. That way, if you have a tiling texture that if you tile it often enough and you can start to see patterns, this will avoid that. So just for an example, instead of saying I want this to be, say I want something that's 20 meters wide, and this is now one meter. Or actually, is that true? No, that's not true. Sorry, this is 2 meters wide because the mesh itself is 2 by 2, but the object scaling is at the 1. And we can include scale to take this scaling factor into consideration as well. So if I say 20 by 20, I can just tick include scale, and there you go. So here we can start to see at this scale, with this view, we can see a pretty significant pattern right here. And that just keeps tiling over and over. So instead of doing that, what we can do is, let's say, make tiles of 5 by 5 instead. And duplicate that. Okay, so this is much less of a discernible pattern. We can still kind of make out these darker gray ones, for instance, but you can't tell here anymore. There's no real pattern to be found here. And the nice thing about it being instance is that it's still going to be able to take all these together, and this is going to be one batch if it's just this big tile, but this in multiple tiles, because they all share materials and the same mesh, is also going to be rendered in one batch. So it's not really an issue for performance. Okay, let's go to the streets now. Oh, yeah, one last thing, everything has colliders, if I haven't mentioned that before. Now, these are the prefabs that I made, which you can find in Street. But you can make as many as you want with all kinds of variations you can think of. And so these are just examples of what you could use. Most of these are pretty wide, pretty broad kind of roads. And of course, everything tiles together. So let's take a look at one of these. And as you can see, it just has the asphalt and these decals. Now, these aren't truly decals; they are just a plane placed on the same height as the asphalt is. So it doesn't include a decal system, which you could use if you want to. It's just not here. And these can be edited in whatever way you like. So we can just choose to make a prefab that has only 1 lane or 2 lanes or whatever you want. Just and because the asphalt is one mesh and these are all based on basic plane, right? Which is just Instead of the standard Unity plane, which has 10 subdivisions, this has no subdivisions. So it's like making a plane in a... It's just a quad, essentially. But they're all using the same mesh, so that means that when we're rendering it, it's going to be highly optimized. Right, so it's going to be able to draw all the asphalt in one go. And these are separated into two materials, essentially for the longer repeating kind of lines. I have this one. And then all the other stuff is also rendered in one batch. So it's really optimal and quite an optimized way of doing it. And this one is the reverse. And I will say something about that. The Unity will start to see mesh as different when you scale it to -1 in an odd way. And that just means that if they are not all negative, or if they're all negative, or if they're all positive, that's fine. But something like this will not be okay. This is now suddenly an entirely different mesh for Unity, essentially. So it's better to make your prefab this way, so it's all rendered in one go. So because instead, if I do this, for instance, if I say -1, which is the exact same visual result, right? It's not gonna render it as nicely as before. So here we can already see this is now suddenly a different mesh because it has odd scaling, and those are separate. And now this is all kinds of weird way of separating things, and it just adds a ton of stuff. So don't do that. If you want to make your own prefabs and you need something inverted, do it this way, by just taking the normal prefab as it was and just placing them differently. Now lastly, I want to show you the decals, which again are not truly decals, but they get the job done, especially in this kind of modular scenario. And for that, let me just show you the materials as well. I have an asphalt, one for curbs, one for sidewalk tiles, one for the street decals, which is everything you see except for this crack, which repeats, and these. So everything else is in this material. And I have a duplicate right here. And that's just to make sure that some of these lines, for instance, the gutters and the dirt that I showed you earlier, I always wanted to be over top of what this is. And that's why I have a separate material for that to change the render queue. I will show that in a minute in the main example scene when it comes to sorting orders. So these you can place wherever you want. Mostly these are going to be used to make your prefabs, because it's fine if those repeat, but you may not always want a manhole in the same place on every bit. So let's just quickly go over what we have. We have all these different versions of lines. These are the variations you can use for your road. I have a couple of different cracked decals that you can place. They're pretty subtle, but they do break away from a repeating pattern if you want to use those. A couple of different things right here. Manholes, and other things you can place on sidewalks, just a planter, storm drain, that kind of thing. And a bunch of splatters that you could use as well. This is a big one. This one's extremely subtle, but pretty nice if you scale them up big enough. It's not something you would immediately notice, but you will notice it if it's missing. Let's put it that way. Now, the way this is set up, again, this renders it pretty inexpensively. which is just another variation of using a UV offset on an instance material. So the texture is quite big, and it's essentially a texture atlas, as you can see. And every prefab, again, just shares the same plane for every decal you see, and it just uses its own tiling and offset to make sure it only shows the appropriate thing, but it's great for performance. Now let's just go back to the example scene, and I'll tell you the last little bit about sorting orders and stuff, just to make sure everything is rendered properly, because there are going to be scenarios where you have decals on top of decals, or to put it more abstract, transparent objects over top of transparent objects, like this scenario. And that's the reason why there's a second material for the gutter and for the dirt, and that has a higher render queue. So this one's 2450, which is for most lines, and then I have this one at 2451 for all these decals, and then all the way up top is this stuff. So say if you want this to be lower, you can do that, or if you want these lines to be always on top or something else, you can do so, but that's not what I want in this scenario. Now, the last thing I did, or last thing you're gonna get, is just a tiny, pretty simple script, but it is quite a nice thing to have, and I'm just gonna show you that by playing and take a look at how the scene is rendered. Obviously there's a bunch of car stuff and post-processing that's just increasing the batches for now. But generally speaking, Unity will, or most render engines will render opaque geometry from front to back, which makes sense. And then it's rendered like this. Like some parts are grouped together, as you can see, but certainly not everything. And that will increase the number of batches it takes to render all this geometry. And the same goes for the decals, really. It's not able to put everything together. And that's just because of how the sorting order is grouped together. And what this little script does is it just says, it allows you to sort by material, essentially. And you generally will want to do that with, or it's something you can try, at least. It kind of depends on your scene in your game. If you want to apply this, it's just another thing you could use. And basically all these opaque materials I want to group together because they don't really need to be separate in terms of sorting order. So we can have all this stuff together and all these go together, and that's just, some bits are still unique. For instance, this sidewalk in, which is some kind of 90-degree corner, and this 45-degree corner, because they're unique meshes, it will do that separately. But the curbs, for instance, are all just one thing right now, instead of separating them out, saying this bit here and this bit here are separate. They're now all together, so it's pretty nice. Now you can do that with transparent materials, but then you don't have control over how things are rendered, about, in the sense that it won't be able to give you control over how over what decal should be on top, essentially. Not in this script. It's certainly doable, but that's not included here. Anyway, that pretty much wraps it up for what you're getting in this asset. And the nice thing about it is just, it also gives an example for how a scene like this could be set up, because it runs at, I don't know, I'm looking at choppy, at something choppy on my screen, but it still runs at 70 FPS supposedly. But the main point is it runs at about 70 to 80 draw calls and around 100 batches right now, and that's with post-processing, and some of those are set to pretty high, I think, and this car thing, a whole bunch of other stuff. And for a scene that's about 200 meters by 200 meters, you're probably not going to be rendering much more than that anyway. In a city environment, in terms of visibility, you're not going to see more. So it runs pretty well, and it has very high customizability. And since things are occluded statically and there aren't super huge static meshes, that's very helpful for performance as well.